It sort of brings back what Paul was saying before lunch on a good society and a good economy, as opposed to a flawed society and a flawed economy. The obvious question, I think, Peter, first is, where are we on this sliding scale in Australia? Are we Soviets? I was really taken by your comment earlier, how easy people let government take away freedom in Victoria.
Well, not just Victoria, by the way.
And not just Victoria.
I just singled it out because it's the worst government in Australia. There are rather bad governments in Australia, let me assure you of that. Well, is the United States late-stage Soviet communism? No, I'm sorry now, but
that's not the point.
It's a deeply flawed society. You're absolutely right. For an advanced economy, it should not be showing all of these symptoms. But it struck me as I've been following the US election. I remember living through the '68 election in the United States, where it looked to me as if America was tearing itself apart. There were assassinations, there were race riots, there was Vietnam. And you wondered how they would ever put that together again. And just as you thought America had come to an end, along comes a Ronald Reagan, sunny, optimistic, who reinvents what I would call the best of America. And it has, the one thing I'd say for American society, in my experience, has the ability to reinvent itself, right? They can have a civil war and kill 1 million people, but they can reinvent themselves. You're absolutely right about the blue states on the oceans, but remember, there's a lot of people, God-fearing people in the middle of America who really care for their country and who do believe in service and government, and they're the people, in my view, who will resurrect it again.
All right, Judith, your views on where we are. Of course, America was founded on democracy. Again, different from Russia. But now we see this creeping crony capitalism. I mean, it's a long way from Adam Smith, isn't it?
It is a long way from Adam Smith, and I actually did my homework and read your article, Neil, and enjoyed it a great deal. And one of the ideas which I found very compelling was that we're effectively in a second Cold War. But if we go back to the first Cold War, where the West was against the Soviet Union, and, dare I say it, even under Whitlam, federal government spending was under 20%. What is it now? It's over 27% and heading north. And then, of course, if we add in the states, we're looking at government spending being greatly in excess of 30%. And, it's spent on all sorts of things. But, there is clearly some very strong elements of both government, either actual domination or funding domination in a lot of sectors. And that, I think, then gives rise to the legitimate label of crony capitalism. Does that make us a much weaker partner contending in the second Cold War with China? I think it does. And I mean, the Chinese political leadership must think, well, you're not that different from us, Actually, we're kind of better at a lot of this stuff than you because, you've got elections and you have to do a bit of persuasion here, whereas they don't. I think this issue, there are two really big issues, I think, is that what are the implications of basically having no budget constraint? A budget constraint in the past meant governments had to, first of all, meet it, but also have the mindset of a trade-off. Now, households understand a trade-off. You have that, but you can't have that. Whereas I think we've completely moved away from the idea of a trade-off. And I think, that is a really important point. And really, what's happening is that we are getting a weakening of the economy, particularly in Australia. I mean, if you look at the productivity figures, we're pretty much back to where we were, well, nearly a decade ago. You know, so there has been no productivity growth for a decade. And the final point I'd like to make is something that Paul Kelly raised, which is if we have higher per capita income, how is it the case that there is a view that we demand more of governments in the way of services? Now, I think something that's really underexplained and underdescribed, in fact, is the power of the providers. You know, the providers basically tell governments that they're needed. They tell governments that the community expects this. We might, in other circumstances, expect members of the community to be responsible themselves, to be reliant and thinking about how they're going to deal with their children and their school children and their older age. But the power of the providers, I think, is really an important part of the story.
And you also touch on the responsibility of the self.
Yeah.
Because when we're talking about productivity, and this has come up as well with families, particularly for white collar, Peter, the world now is actually quite easy. You can take a pill to get thinner. You don't even have to be physically disciplined anymore. Work-life balance. How much of the productivity challenge is that we're all too soft on an individual basis?
Well, I'm obviously too soft on an individual business. You can see that, Ticky. You know, I said in my earlier speech that some things are going up and some things are going down. And one of the things I said is going down is the willingness to incur hardship in a common cause. Now, you might say, oh, we don't need any hardship in any of our common causes today. But I would say the reform of expenditure and the rollback of the state, it will involve some hardship. And is there a recognition that is a common cause for us? It will affect some people more than it will affect other people. And everyone will have to make the sacrifice. But at the end of the day, if you hold out to people that the rollback of the state will bring benefits, they've got to see the benefits in their own lifetimes, in my view. Otherwise, you're just holding out to them a hollow promise. Can it be done? Yes, it was actually done. It has been done in Australia. You know, for a period, there was a period of great Australian exceptionalism. And I think every side of politics would agree with that. But we kind of lost our way in there somewhere. We're not the only country. Obviously, there was a period of great American exceptionalism, and they're losing their way. But these things can be reversed. It takes will and it takes political leadership.
Pruning.
The problem with the soft budget constraint, just to pick up something that Judith was saying, is that it leads to inefficiency. The American welfare state exists. It's the most expensive and least efficient out there. And that's part of what we're seeing in these dreadful public health numbers. The cost of the entitlements keeps going up, and yet the outcomes are actually amongst the worst in the developed world. And it's really spectacular how bad those numbers are, even for California. Of course, it doesn't help if you have large-scale illegal immigration and have a whole bunch of people coming in from Central America, more or less without constraint. But I think that's a really important reason why the soft budget constraint's a problem, as it was in the Soviet Union. Yeah. Firms had no incentive to be efficient. Well, I can assure you healthcare providers in the US have no incentive to be efficient. To respond to something Peter just said, you know, the interesting thing about the red states is that's where the opioid deaths, the deaths of despair, disproportionately happen. And so it's important to realize that part of what motivates people in the red states to vote for Trump, as in 2016, is that they recognize his account of American carnage, to use a phrase he used in 2016. I don't think one should have a rose-tinted view of how middle America is right now, there is a great deal of dissatisfaction and dismay at the sorts of social problems that I was highlighting there. And I tell you all this because I think it's a warning. In some ways, Australia, certainly compared with Britain, is in a strong fiscal position, thanks partly to the work that you did in government. But that strength of the position can in fact be a temptation not to be efficient and not to observe the kind of rules that will lead to efficiency and therefore to productivity growth.
Niall, you ended your address on Elon Musk. And of course, one very big difference between Russia and America is that propaganda was controlled by the state. In America today, it's a little bit unclear who's in control, in that the individual is almost now choosing what evidence they would like to support their position, and they can find it on the net somewhere.
Yeah, it's not quite as much a free-for-all as that implies, Ticky, because up until Elon's purchase of Twitter, there was an extraordinary homogeneity in attitudes amongst the big tech companies that controlled the platforms. And that was very obvious in 2021, when there was a clear collusion between the government and the tech companies to censor or at least to suppress any dissident views on a wide range of issues, including, of course, vaccines, but not only vaccines. So I think we kind of came close, dangerously close in 2021 to a not quite Soviet, but certainly unhealthy relationship between the government and the tech companies that are so dominant in the way that news is disseminated.
So if I can mention another movie, back in the day, Rollerball. I mean, you put yourself up there as James Caan just now. But what are we going to do with these big tech companies?
Well, in some ways, we haven't touched on it, but a new era is dawning in which artificial intelligence is forcing the big tech companies to make much larger capital investments than they hitherto have needed to, because data centers and GPUs are way more expensive than it was to build a social network such as Facebook. And this has two very important implications that one needs to think through. The first is that it transforms economic activity. These big capital expenditures that we're seeing to create the data centers, to create what will be very large new demands on the power grid, that will change the way the economy behaves, and it will create, I'm sure, more inflationary pressures, higher rates than we grew accustomed to in the inter-Cold War years. But the other point, which we haven't touched on, is what this means for white-collar workers. You said, Ticky, a minute ago, white-collar workers have it easy. Well, enjoy it while it lasts. Because if you read Mustafa Suleiman's book, The Coming Wave, or just look at what's happening to call centers and financial services and legal back offices, there is going to be a shock to middle-class employment. That will compare with the China shock to manufacturing employment of the early 2000s. And I don't see anywhere in the Western world that is ready for that.
Okay.
And I can only guess at what the social consequences and political consequences will be when it's clerical white-collar workers that are suddenly being told, thanks, it's been nice knowing you, but AI takes it from here.
Gotcha. Okay. So little time. Judith, I want to hit you actually all up with our Nobel Prize winners the other day. Darren Esimoglu and Simon Johnson and James Robinson, they got that for talking about the importance of institutions. Is this green shoots in terms of new thinking?
Look, I think it was a terrific awarding of a prize. They were all MIT colleagues. One, I think, skedaddled off to the University of Chicago now. And I would recommend, I think this audience would really like the book that two of them wrote, which is called Why Some Nations Fail. And it actually, and it would make a lot of sense to you, Peter. It's basically, their message is that institutions matter. And what do they mean by that? They mean kind of relatively simple things, like the fact that there's law and order, the fact that property rights are protected, the fact that there can be contract enforcement, The fact is that you can creative incentives to invest and realise that people won't come and rob the returns. And they've got some really cute kinds of analyses, which is, for example, Korea. The Northern Koreans and the Southern Koreans, they're identical, right? And so they compared the economic performance of the two Koreas, and of course, well, we know the answer, right? And basically, the answer is institutions. And I mean, they've also got some really interesting stuff about why some colonies were very useful. A lot of people came, they created institutional features which shared the prosperity, whereas there were some colonies, particularly in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, which was a bit more hit and run. They were very exploitative. The colonists came in, they kind of created a gold mine and then left, partly, according to these three authors, because the incidence of disease was so high, no one else wanted to go there. But it's a really compelling story, and I think it has some really important lessons for us, that a strong leader that can get the framework right, that can create the right institutional arrangements and minimise the role of government is actually one that ultimately leads to economic prosperity, and not just economic prosperity all around.
I'll briefly get the lads to comment on that. Peter.
I just want to make one other point, which I think is important for an Australian audience. We did a lot of our restructuring in the manufacturing industry in the 80s and 90s. And we had a lot of dislocation. And I don't think we handled it well, but by and large we came through it. And rather than try and keep a manufacturing industry behind a high tariff wall, we decided we were better to focus on the things that we could do well. We may not be able to outcompete China on widgets, but we can sell China the iron ore to make the widgets. Right? And we readjusted our economy. We are one of the few countries in the world that runs a trade surplus with China. Now, that's not to say we should be soft on China, and as you know, we haven't been. We probably led the pack.
Yep.
But it does mean that there is a significant difference in Australia to the US rust bucket states. We're basically post-rust bucket now. We've gone through that. Now, that's not to understate what's happening in the United States, and I understand it. But I just want to say Australia has done that adjustment. There's no going back. We shouldn't go back. We shouldn't feel as if that's our argument in any sense at all. Right. And I just say from our perspective, the prospect that big tariffs are going to be put on trade into the United States is not one that we would really benefit from.
Neil.
Well, as a committed free trader and devotee of Adam Smith and the Scottish Enlightenment,
that's right. I love you, Scots.
I can only agree with that, and I would add that, of course, what Darren Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, and Jim Robinson have done is to explain to economists what historians of the Scottish Enlightenment have always known. Adam Smith says quite explicitly in The Wealth of Nations that institutions are the reasons for China's having arrived at the stationary state. He was writing at a time when Scotland was probably the fastest growing economy on the planet in the late 18th century. So it's always good when the economists catch up, don't you think?
Yeah, but we put figures on it.
All right.
You make figures up. That's nice too.
Hey, don't give away the secrets.
I've been given a hard wind. I knew we'd end up coming back to Adam Smith. We could have gone so many places.
Everything's Adam Smith.
Thank you to our panel. That was really fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thanks.